On today's episode of Faith and Focus, I really want to discuss this topic of compliance and conformity and how we conform to messages and we change our behavior and our actions, and how people will use compliance and messaging to get other people to conform to messages and behaviors that they want them to conform to. It's coming from this book that I'm reading. It's a really interesting book. And I want to relate this, though, with the church and how the church operates, because obviously the world is going to do what the world's going to do, but what we care about, hopefully, is what the church is engaged in the work of God and expanding the kingdom and sharing the gospel. So I want to discuss that, how pastors and church leaders, unfortunately, sometimes will shortcut this road to compliance and settle for really lesser tricks to get the job done. And so that's what we're going to talk about on this episode. Well, we've been given a lot of examples of conformity over the past couple of years, and we're still seeing it down to this day with all the COVID restrictions and rules and policies and mandates, and I guess I can't say laws. None of them are really laws, I don't think, that have been passed. But these mandates, executive orders, all of these dictates from our governing officials all around the world are being used by our government in order to get people to conform to specific behavior. And you can think of it as nefarious or well-intentioned or good or evil or whatever you think. And in fact, what you think about what the government has done is actually probably indicative of conformity that has already happened to us. Now, all of us are shaped and conformed by the things around us. So it's really impossible to, when people say, well, that person has been brainwashed, really, that's just a pejorative way of saying that person has conformed to a belief or an ideology that I don't agree with or that I think is self-destructive. Well, I've told people before, if I think like what I believe, of course I believe what I believe is better or more well-intentioned or more correct than what other people believe. Now, that comes across as like a snobbish, arrogant attitude, but I don't really intend it that way, and I think we all kind of believe that. If I thought what somebody else believed was better or more well-intentioned or more true, then I would believe what they believe. But I don't. I believe what I believe, and you believe what you believe because you think it's the best thing to believe. It's the most accurate representation of reality. So there's nothing wrong with having what you believe and kind of sticking to that corner. But the problem is, because that we innately know that what we believe, at least as far as we're concerned, is better, it's maybe more moral, it's more well-intentioned, it's more loving, it's more caring, it's more accurate to truth, and everything else is not as pure or well-intentioned as what we believe, we look at other people's beliefs in a negative light, and we can treat the people negatively. And that's why the idea of I just believe what I believe, but they have been brainwashed. Well, they're going to look the same way at you because they think what you believe is obviously ridiculous if it's different than what they believe. So they're going to say you've been brainwashed. So this idea of people being brainwashed really is just a negative way, almost kind of a way of dismissing what a person believes. It's kind of like when we just throw out the word, they're a racist or they're a bigot or whatever, one of these isms. We just throw them out there as a way of dismissing that person and what they believe and not actually having to engage with it. If we can just say that person has been brainwashed, then it kind of lets us off the hook of trying to engage with that person, because then if they're brainwashed, I can't reason with them, so why even try? Whereas if we realize that no, people are people and they can choose and believe and listen to evidence and and come to conclusions just like us. Kind of gives a little bit more respect to what people believe. But what I want to talk about this morning, though, really comes from, I'm reading this book. It's, kind of a classic book, The Social Animal by Elliot Aronson. And it's really good. And I'll probably do a couple podcasts from it. But as I'm reading it, this book is, 20, 30 years old. And I'm just reading it thinking like, wow, this is so applicable to what is going on. You can see it so clearly with what has happened, no matter where you stand on this whole COVID debate and what has happened these last 2 years and the lockdowns and the policies. But it's just so applicable to what is happening. And in the first chapter, he's talking about this idea of conformity. And conformity is not a bad thing. We all conform to certain things. And in fact, you can kind of see it the most in young people. Middle-aged, high school-aged kids. Conformity is like everything. This is why kids dress in black and paint their fingernails and wear their hair a certain way and say certain words. When I drive Uber and have people in the backseat of my car, college students who, are 18, 19 years old, I just hear the language, and I don't mean like foul language, but just like the words that they say, and I just think, where do these words come from? Like, what do these things mean? I feel like I'm so out of the loop, but everyone seems to know the language because they've all conformed to this groupthink. And so they're all using Snapchat. They all use the same social media. Why? Because that's what all their friends do. So they're all conforming. And young people specifically, that's kind of almost how they navigate through the world, is by conforming to their peer group and rebelling against anyone else other than their peer group. But we all conform to a certain extent, maybe some more than others. But conformity is not necessarily a bad thing. And what I want to preface at the top of this episode is this idea that conformity, even in Christianity, is not a bad thing. Conformity to something as opposed to something else might be a bad thing. And what I mean is, so when I was reading his book, and obviously this is not a Christian book at all, so I'm reading it through a biblical lens, but I'm just kind of taking the information that he's giving and filtering it through this lens. But I thought when Paul is talking to the Galatians, he says, "My children, with whom I am again in labor until Christ is formed in you." So there's this conformity that Paul is laboring to see produced in the Galatians, but it's conformity to Christ. That's what we want to see within the church, is conformity to the image of Christ. We want to see ourselves, and hopefully, if we're in any kind of Christian leadership, if you're parents with your children, you want to see them conformed to the image of Christ, and that's an admirable thing, and that's a noble thing. Unfortunately, a lot of the times we will try to shortcut that a little bit, because he says, I'm in labor until Christ is formed in you. This is a disciplined, hard process to just labor over people, to see Christ formed in them. It's much easier a lot of the times to just get people to conform to certain behaviors, certain patterns of how people act in certain situations. So that's why you'll have, I had one professor who lived in the South, was born in the South, lived in the South, but then grew up north. And he was just shocked at how in the South, Christians would stand outside of the church and be smoking cigarettes while they're scandalized by northern Christianers who use foul language. And then he'd come up north, and people in the north would be prim and proper in their speech, but be scandalized by southerners who are smoking cigarettes. So it's just this conformity to behavior and our peer groups around us. Sometimes it's easier to get people to just conform to behavior. And so we'll use God and rules to get people to conform to behavior. Or sometimes it's easier to conform to people. My pastor always tells the story. He didn't go to Bob Jones University, but he knows people that did. And he always tells the story how, and I don't know if it was Bob Jones Sr. or just one of the Bob Joneses, but whenever he would preach, he would do this. Put his hand over his mouth like this. And people graduating from Bob Jones would start to do that. They would do this when they're preaching. And eventually somebody said, and I'm assuming that this is a true story. I don't I'm just taking this as true. My pastor says it's true, so I'm conforming to what he says is true. But people would do this, and then eventually somebody said, why do people do this? Oh, I don't know. And it finally came to realize, well, that's what Bob Jones Sr. or whoever it was. That's what he did. He'd do this, and somebody said, well, he did that because he had false teeth, and he was holding his teeth in or whatever. So that just reveals the ridiculousness to which conformity to people. Sometimes you're emulating things that there's no moral component to that. It was just and I have a book somewhere about Charles Spurgeon. He's this famous preacher back before there was movie theaters and Netflix and all this kind of entertainment we can get. So people would go out to these tent preachers to get entertainment. Now, I mean, some of them maybe went out because they thought they should be listening to the Word of God and preachers or whatever, but a lot of it was entertainment, and they were entertaining people. And in the book, he's talking to preachers, and he's teaching them how to do certain motions and how to preach certain ways and make certain in order to engage your audience and keep them entertained and stuff like that. And what that does is then it causes people to want to emulate Charles Spurgeon. And you see that today. If you look at certain famous preachers and pastors, and then watch people who are sort of disciples of them, they emulate their mentor's posture and behavior and their way of speaking. I mean, it's just natural. This is what people do. So you can identify, you can conform through just compliance to behavior. You can conform through identifying with a person. In fact, these are the 3 different forms of conformity that Aronson talks about in The Social Animal. There's compliance, normally to behavior. There's identification. So I'm identifying with a person. That would be like Charles Spurgeon, the Bob Jones thing. And then there's internalization, where you have actually internalized the message. And he says with compliance, it's the level of compliance that most researchers see where there's little difference between the behavior of humans and other animals. So they'll do tests on animals, and they'll say, okay, if you put cheese at the end of a race, a rat is X amount of more likely to complete the race this much faster because there's a reward at the end of it. Or if there's some threat or punishment for not completing it. And we realize, well, people operate that same way, but this is kind of the lowest form of conformity, is just to get people to comply to behavior. Identification is just a little bit more up than that. It's still behavior modification, but this happens because somebody that we identify with, somebody that we respect, somebody who's attractive, is emulating a certain behavior, and we want to not get a reward like a carrot or a stick situation. We don't want, it's not a direct reward that way, but it's kind of the reward of being like this person that we want to emulate, that we respect. So we identify with, and this is a lot of times celebrities. Why do we care what celebrities think? Well, it's because we can identify with them. They're attractive, well-spoken people, and we want to be like them. We want to emulate them. So whatever that celebrity is doing, we want to behave just like them. And then he says of internalization, this is the highest form of conformity. It says, this is the desire to be right. The reward for the belief is intrinsic. So just, it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. It doesn't matter what I'm getting from this. Just the fact that I'm doing what is right or believing what is right, that is reward in and of itself. He says, once it's part of our own system, it becomes independent of its source and will become extremely resistant to change. This, I believe, is what Paul is talking about. This, I'm laboring until Christ is formed in you. You need to internalize this and have it be a part of who you are. If the Galatians were only going to follow Paul in the message of the gospel because Paul was the one preaching it, that's not good enough in Paul's opinion. And in fact, this is what has happened with the Galatians. As Paul came in and preached, they accepted the gospel willingly. He left, but then some other people, these Judaizers, came in with a different message, and the Galatians wanted to what? They wanted to identify with them. They respected them. They wanted their approval, so they adopted their message. So it was clear they had not internalized, and that doesn't mean that they weren't believers, but they had not internalized the importance of being conformed to the image of Christ and the gospel the way that, the social animal might talk about. They had identified with Paul, and now somebody who's more attractive has come along, and now they've identified with them and their message. So there's not a permanence to it. With the gospel and discipling people and mentoring people and wanting to see them conform to the image of Christ, we want them to eventually internalize this. We don't want them just doing it because we say so, or whoever says so. We want, when we're long gone, we want them to continue on because they've internalized this message. And you can see, when I was reading this, I'm just thinking two parallel thoughts. Wow, you can see how this operates in the church, but you see how this operated in our world these last 2 years. And it was just such a clear picture, and you'll probably resonate with some of the stuff. The compliance and the conformity in COVID policies. So just think about, like this 15 days to slow the spread. When all of this first started, 2 years ago now, they said, hey, we're going to ask you to lock down, not go to work, not go shopping, just shelter in place for 15 days. Why? Because we need to slow the spread. Okay, well, they want all of us to behave a certain way. Don't go out, don't go shopping, don't whatever. Okay. And then this is like, okay, get vaccinated. They want us to behave a certain way. We want you to conform to this behavior of getting vaccinated or getting boosted. And then wearing the mask has become like a behavior thing. Social distancing. All of these different behaviors, the powers that be have wanted us to conform us to a certain behavior pattern in an effort to try to slow the spread of this virus. And you can say whether that's right or wrong, or that gets to more questions of internalization. But this is just, they're wanting us to comply with this behavior. And for the most part, people, I think, did that to begin with. They did comply. And compliance is not, it's the lowest form of conformity. It's I will behave and do what's right if there's a reward or a lack of punishment for it. So, okay, fine. If I have to shelter in place for 15 days, then I'll be rewarded with my freedom at the end of it. Fine. If I wear this mask, okay, fine. My loved one won't get sick or will be lessened in their likelihoods of getting sick. Okay, fine, I'll do that. There's a reward. But then once it becomes apparent that that reward is not coming or the punishment is going to continue, then compliance is going to drop off. People are just going to say, well, if I'm not going to be rewarded for this, I'm going to just stop. And in fact, you actually saw that. You've seen people from the CDC and different agents of the state say things like, well, we can't remove certain mandates because if we do that, then we've removed the carrot to incentivize their behavior. Or we remove the stick. Certain mayors of cities, Bill de Blasio, for instance, you may have seen that video, disgusting video of him eating that cheeseburger and fries on TV, trying to say, if you get vaccinated, you can get a free burger and fry. And then when that didn't work, he eventually said, okay, we've tried the carrot. Now we're going to go with the stick. Now we're going to punish. So this is just compliance. It's this, they're wanting to change your behavior to conform to what they want you to do. And so it really becomes a power struggle. I mean, think about with children. If you're a parent with children, what you're doing a lot of the times, because kids can't internalize morality or certain belief systems. They just don't have the mental capacities to do it. So what your job is as a parent is to get them to comply in order to keep them safe, and then instill in them, when the time comes, to instill in them this internalized behavior of why we do the things that we do. This is why children require discipline, because they have no self-discipline. That's the difference. They have no self-discipline, so you have to impose discipline on them. And then hopefully as they get older, they then discipline themselves. So, and if you've got a child who will not comply to your demands, well, what is that? That is a power struggle. That is a child saying, you're not rewarding me enough, or I don't really care about the punishment. And you're saying, well, hey, I will reward you. And so you're trying to get them to behave in a certain way, and they won't behave in a certain way. So this really, when the state has operated on this level of compliance with the people in regards to COVID policy, wear the mask, shelter in place, social distance, get this vaccine, we'll give you free food, you'll be put into a lottery, you won't be killing grandma, all of these different things, you'll with the vaccine in particular, you will stop spreading the virus if you get vaccinated. Well, that's a huge reward. Well, then once we found out, oh man, this does not stop spreading this virus, well, then it's like, well, there's no reward for me to get this thing. So it's clear that once this, when there's no reward or behavior, then it just reveals this is just a power struggle. The state is saying, you will conform to what we're telling you to do. And the people are saying, no, we're not going to. We've done everything that you've asked. The rewards weren't forthcoming. The punishment is too severe, whatever. This is insane. So it's just a power struggle. And what has happened with COVID stuff is it moved on to identification. I think it started as compliance. Everyone was basically willing to wear a mask for a short period of time, shelter in place, all of this stuff, not go shopping, not open your store. Eventually people just got to the point where they're saying, we're done with this. So what has happened is now what the state has had to do, and whether this is intentional or not, or whether it has just happened, is people that we identify with and we respect as a society, they've had to be recruited in order to be almost like a propaganda wing for the state to enforce COVID policies. So that's why, when you see celebrities out there making videos telling us to get vaccinated, when you see, well-respected, news anchors, people on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, saying certain things, I've been vaccinated. Trump himself coming out and saying, hey, I've been vaccinated and I've gotten my booster. You should too, because the vaccines, what is happening? These are people that we ostensibly should want to identify with. Well, look, don't you see this person? You look up to this celebrity, right? Well, they're wearing their mask and they're social distancing and they've gotten their vaccine. Don't you want to just be like this person? And of course, the other side has their people. No, I'm not going to identify with these people. I respect these people more. This is kind of the big scandal going on with Joe Rogan. That's what this is. This is a battle over conformity or not conformity to certain beliefs and behaviors. And we as people have our different groups of people that we identify with. The establishment has their politicians, their corporate press people, that they think these should be the people that you identify with. These should be the people who you listen to and conform to their messaging, because these are the models of truth and righteousness and accuracy. And other groups are saying, no, we respect Joe Rogan. We identify with him. And we're going to listen to him and the host he has on. So it's this power struggle between who is going to get their messaging out and who's going to listen to who. And then the problem, though, with this COVID thing, and this is taking it now onto internalization, is now, and this is where the Biden administration is finding that it's very difficult now. They're wanting to roll back, I think, some of these things, some of these mandates, because, cynically, I think it's because they have an election coming up and they realize people hate this stuff. But they're wanting to roll back some of these mandates. And you're seeing this breakout in pretty drastic ways in Canada, people demanding these mandates be rolled back and the government saying no. But I think here in America, the Biden administration and more left-leaning governors and politicians around the country are now wanting to roll back mandates and kind of declare a victory over this virus. But people who have listened to them and complied with their demands and then identified with their media personalities and the attractive propagandists of this messaging, they've identified with that. They have now internalized this messaging. So, why did masks, people will say masks shouldn't be a political or an ideological thing. Well, okay, maybe they shouldn't be, but they have become that. Why? Well, because it started out as compliance. Everyone did it for the most part. I think it was like 97, 98% mask compliance. But eventually people began doing it because they identified with their person on the news or in the movies. Celebrities were wearing their mask. So I want to identify with that person, or the person I respect is not wearing their mask. My peer groups are not wearing their mask, so I'm taking off my mask. Whoever you identified with, you continued on with that behavior or discontinued that behavior. Wearing them then became a sign of respect for people who continued wearing them, because why would I continue doing this if it doesn't make any sense? If if the CDC comes out and says, hey, it's basically just face decoration at this point, it's fashion, it doesn't do anything, these cloth masks. But why do I have to keep doing it? I don't want to seem ridiculous. So the messaging kind of becomes, it's a sign of respect, it's a care for neighbor, etc. Or conversely, taking them off as a sign of freedom, returning to normalcy, all of that stuff. So they've become so ingrained that now they've moved beyond compliance, identification, and now people have internalized these beliefs. If you wear a mask, you are a good person. If you take off your mask, you believe in freedom and individual freedom. Those are the internalized beliefs. So now when somebody who's a freedom-loving person looks at a mask-wearing person, they think, oh, that person is just brainwashed. When a person with a mask looks at a person who doesn't wear a mask and believes in individual freedom, well, that person is just a horrible, terrible person. If they were a good person, they would X, Y, and Z. They would get vaccinated. They would wear a mask. They would do all these things. So now they've internalized that it's not just the behavior, it's indicative of a deeper problem with those people themselves. So now it takes a lot. It's extremely resistant to change, as it says in Social Animal. It's now they're trying to roll back these policies, but guess what? People have already internalized them. So now, and that works both ways. The people who now have taken their mask off and are like, we're not getting vaccinated or we're not getting any more boosters, we're done with this. Those people now have internalized deeply this belief of freedom, that the state does not have my best interest at heart. And if the state ever tries to pull this again or ramp up these measures, we will resist. That's what you're seeing with the truckers in Canada, right? No, we are done. We are not allowing you to do this anymore. And it's internalized now for the people who believe in these measures and conforming to these behaviors. They're internalized to the point where now their leaders are trying to say, hey, we need to dial this back. We're going to lose an election if we don't take these masks off and stop these mandates. The people, though, are saying, no, we can't do that. We've got to get more boosters, and we've got to wear more masks, and we got to wear better masks, and it's just bizarre to see. But you can see it if you've had your eyes open. And again, I'm not making a judgment. Ironically, I'm wearing my defund pilot. This was not intended, by the way. So you probably know where I stand. But I'm not making a value judgment necessarily on either one. I'm just trying to explain that as far as I can see things, this is what has happened over the past 2 years. The state has demanded people comply for 15 days with certain behaviors in order to have a certain outcome. And there was a reward and there was a punishment. Punishment was if you don't comply, people will die. The reward is if we just do this, we'll flatten the curve, everything will go back to normal. Well, once we realized that wasn't going to happen, people went one of two ways. They either identified with their people that said, we're done with this, we're not doing this anymore, or identified with people who were maybe in the middle, let's just keep going along, this will eventually get over with, or identified with people that, no, this is terrible, we have to keep doing this and we have to ramp things up. So this identifying with certain groups of people who were giving messaging, the Joe Rogans or the corporate press, one of the two. You've identified with somebody along that spectrum. And then we've all internalized a belief structure around this conformity. That if you don't believe in getting vaccinated and getting your booster and following all of these policies, wearing your mask, all this kind of obsession, you are a terrible, no good, rotten, all the words, racist, right-wing, fanatic, all this kind of stuff. To the point where, it was just comical. Just as, there was an image, and if I can find it, I'll try to cut it into here, but there was this image that talked about all of the radical right-wingers that Joe Rogan has on his podcast. And it had people who were so left-wing, it was comical to see them get lumped into this right-wing fanatic group. But the reason that happened was because they didn't conform to the narrative of this COVID stuff. They said, no, this is not good. We're not going to do this. That because the messaging is, if you don't do this, what has been internalized by one side is, if you don't do this, you are a radical, anti-vax, right-wing conspiracy theorist, all this kind of stuff. That is the messaging. And then on the other side is, if you go along with this, you are a statist, you believe in fascism, you're no better than a Nazi, sympathizer, all this kind of stuff. This is what has happened to the vast majority of us. And good or bad, that's how I see things having happened over the past 2 years. Now, what does this have to do with the church and Christianity? Well, I've already talked about, the goal in Christianity is to see Christ formed in us. Okay? To see the image of Christ not only established in us, but through evangelism, discipleship. We want to see it in other people. Parents with their kids. If you've got kids, you want them to grow up to be followers of Christ. But the problem is, and parents see this, I think it's most clearly seen in children. Children who grow up in a Christian home are going to church. Maybe they behave well. They follow all the rules. But then it comes out, wow, they really don't know the Lord at all. Well, what has happened? Well, they never went past compliance. They've never gone beyond identifying with maybe their peer group of people who behave a certain way or think certain things. You see it when young people grow up and go to college. They were just such good, church-going Christian people. What happened when they went to college? They went nuts. Well, what has happened was they maybe identified with their parents, what their parents believed, what their friends in youth group taught, what their youth pastor taught them and believed. But once they went to college, now they had a new group of people to identify with. People who didn't believe what they believed. A professor who taught what their youth pastor didn't teach. And they wanted to please and identify with that professor or their peer group. So they abandoned their beliefs. It never went beyond that. They never fully identified and internalized this message and conformed to the image of Christ. That's not to say that they may not be believers or anything like that, but just as far as their behavior and what they're living out, they never really internalized this. You see it, I think, in the way that churches behave, the way that churches operate, the way that pastors preach and teach and view discipleship. I think it comes out in that. It's much easier to get people to just change their behavior. So we've got a church full of people, and marriages are really struggling. So, we're going to just teach and model good marriages. We're going to have a series on how to be a better husband or a better wife. So you got to communicate. You got to wash the dishes. You've got to share your emotions. You've got to, all these kinds of different things. Spend 15 minutes a day, seeing how their day went. It's all of this different stuff that is maybe good advice, but it has the potential to only be surface level conformity. I will comply to these behavior patterns so I can get the reward of a good marriage, or to avoid the punishment of a divorce or a miserable marriage. I will do these things in order to not get in trouble by my parents, or to date this cute girl that's at my youth group. All these different things. All it is compliance. It's not conformity to the image of Christ. Or, and this is why too, I think, because churches operate a lot more like businesses. Why do we want pastors, people who are at the front of the church, to be eloquent, articulate, well informed, able to communicate well, funny, relatable? Um, it's because we want the people to identify with the pastor and then change their behavior in accordance with whatever that pastor is telling them. Now, I'm not saying this to be malicious in any way. We all do this. We all operate this way. I want people to listen to what I'm saying, so I need to behave in such a way as in order to get them to conform to what I'm saying, because I want people to listen to what I'm saying. But what it is, it's a cheapened way of getting to what we desire. All people desire to see people living for Christ. It's just a question of how do we get there. The easier route is to just get people to comply, offer them rewards or punishments. So sometimes that comes in the form of even bringing God into this from a standpoint of, you better behave and do these things, otherwise God will punish you. Or if you behave in this way, God will bless you and your family. So it really turns God then into this person who's blessing and cursing based on good behavior, bad behavior, and the sad reality is that that's not the way things always work out. We live in America, so I mean, if you're listening to this and you don't live in America, I don't know where you live, but I live in America, and things go pretty well for you by default here in America. We're pretty blessed in and of itself to just be born in America, but things do go wrong. And it's when things go wrong when people have never moved beyond compliance. If I just live a good Christian life, no bad things will happen to me. Well, that's not only unbiblical, it may actually be anti-biblical. But the reality is something bad will happen to you. And when that does, if all you viewed God as is a dispenser of rewards for good behavior, then when something bad happens, it's like, well, if I'm not going to be rewarded for my behavior, why even maintain the behavior? I'll just stop living this Christian life. I know somebody who had the audacity to say, and he wasn't a follower of Christ, and anyway, I mean, he was not had his toes in the water, but I remember him saying, his, I think, girlfriend at the time was pregnant. And he said, kind of like audaciously, like, if God doesn't give me a healthy child, I won't serve him. And he was concerned about having a child that had like a birth defect or whatever, And it's just like, so that just shows you right there, his mentality is, I will comply with anything that God asks me to do. I mean, up to a certain extent, but only insofar as I get a reward from it. If I don't get my reward, well, then you can just take this whole God thing and, dispense with it. And the sad reality is, in that case, he did have a healthy child, and he still told God to shove it. So there was no conformity to the image of Christ going on there at all. But I think that's the danger within Christianity, is we want people to conform. But oftentimes we want people to conform to behavior. We want people to conform to pastors or Christian leaders. This is why it's so devastating when Christian leaders who are so public fall into sin I try to share with people, like, I am not without my faults. Like, if anyone knows me, I definitely have to reiterate all the time, you should not be modeling yourself after me at all. And we should all be saying that. Like, I am not what we should be conforming to. We need to be conforming to Christ, because he's never going to let you down. He's never going to give you up. I'm kind of doing the Rickroll thing. But he will always do what is right. He's not going to abandon you. So with us, though, as people, the danger is we get people to just follow us in our messaging. And then when we fall, when a prominent, it looks so bad for Christianity. When in reality, it's like, well, Christ hasn't changed. Like I'm not following Christ because that person was perfect. That's how you've internalized, or at least are internalizing the message of the gospel. Is it doesn't matter whether X, Y, or Z public Christian falls away from the faith or falls into sin. That wasn't who I was contingent on walking with God. My walk with God wasn't contingent on them anyway. So what I really think, though, needs to happen within Christianity, and we talk about discipleship, but I don't know that we really understand what Paul is saying, like the labor that goes into seeing Christ be formed in another person. That is a long-term effort. And because of the way that the church is structured and the way that the church operates, unfortunately, a lot of the times pastors are not at churches long enough to establish relationships with people and to see this long-term investment into people, to see Christ formed in them. So they want to see behavior change and modification and conformity to Christian rules and ethics, because why? That looks good on a resume when you're applying for another pastor at a different church. Well, I was able to grow this church from X amount to X amount because we had this program and that program and these people did that and this. And so we need to get people to conform to Christian behavior, and we're going to shortchange this internalizing of the gospel and being conformed to the image of Christ. We're going to shortchange that and just settle for compliance or identification, which is going to change the way we do church and change the way we disciple. And it's going to have long-term ramifications, just like with the COVID stuff. Once you realize, wow, we need to really change course on the way we're doing things, it's going to be a hard sell because people will at that time have internalized the wrong message. They will have complied and identified and then internalized this belief that if I just do good, God will reward me. Well, that doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes bad stuff just happens. And if we have not really understood who Christ is and who God is, we're going to internalize the wrong message, we're going to promote the wrong message, and end up getting people to comply and conform to us as people, us as parents with our children, and neglecting Christ. Christ will just be kind of excised from the whole situation entirely, and we'll just be doing our thing, like Samson, who was strong and would go fight the Philistines, but Judges says he didn't realize the Spirit of God had left him. The Spirit of God's like, well, you apparently don't need me here. You've got everything settled. Well, it didn't turn out too well for Samson in fighting the Philistines, and it doesn't turn out that well for the church either. So I really think that we need to retool the way that we do discipleship and the way we view discipleship and how pastors and teachers and leaders fit into that. So maybe that'll be a teaching and an episode for another time, but that's what I have for you today. I hope you have a great week. Well, Faith in Focus is a ministry of In Faith. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast don't necessarily reflect the views and opinions of In Faith as a mission. If you like what you heard on this episode, why don't you become a monthly supporter of the ministry? It really helps me out. $10 a month or whatever the Lord lays on your heart. So if you're interested in becoming a partner, you can text the word discipleship to 41444 or head over to infaith.org/Dennis-Southerby. And if you have any questions or topics that you would like me to address on a future episode of Faith in Focus, why don't you shoot me an email? You can email me at dennissoutherby@infaith.org. Just put in the subject line, question for Faith in Focus or something like that. So I can see it, know that it's from you, and know that it's an issue that you would like me to address.